When we talk about the digital divide, we're talking about a technology problem caused by technology, really. This is the ever-growing separation between those of us who have got access to the kinds of hardware and software and broadband connectivity and subscriptions and skills that we need to participate in a fully digital society. But there's an increasingly large number of people who don't have access to all of those things. They're getting left behind for various reasons. It's a big problem. It's a global problem. And there are governments all over the world trying to figure it out. One person who's got a suggestion is Chloe Tartan. She's got a rich and varied academic background that we'll find out about, but she thinks blockchain should be playing an important role. It's not necessarily the first thing we'd think of in times of a climate crisis, but nonetheless, it could offer solutions to a more equitable digital future for us all. Listen on to find out more. Welcome to the Tech for Good podcast, Chloe. Thanks for joining us this evening. It's a bit late in the day, I know, and it's nearly Christmas, but you've given us the time anyway. So maybe you could do us all a favour and let us know a bit more about yourself. What's your background? What's your current role in the world?
Current role is tech sustainability consultant manager. Background is I stayed in school for as long as I could. Physics bachelor's, then went on to do space science and engineering. Yeah, that was cool. I wanted to go to space, but it's a bit far.
It's not too late.
And then I moved more into the engineering part of science. So jumped into photonics, just like the science of light. So anything to do with light, and ended up doing a PhD. I told you I stayed at school for a long time, where I made weird and wacky little devices using liquid crystals. You might have heard them in your displays, LCD screens. And I made something really small go invisible once, and I got a patent for invisibility cloaking. So that was
No way.
Yeah.
Right. I know we're talking about something else on this podcast, but I've got to ask you about that. You own a patent for an invisibility cloak.
Yeah. If you were really
I'm just
small,
leaving silence here for you to fill it with actual information.
Yeah. So if you were like the size of bacteria or a bed bug or maybe a red blood cell, I could give you an invisibility cloak.
Right. Okay. I mean, that's great. I mean, that is great. What are the applications? Do you know what? We could go right down a rabbit hole, couldn't we?
So then, So then after that, I decided to solve real world problems, but that was fun. And I decided to move into sustainability because, there's even a story behind that. My last conference for my PhD, I gave a talk in Brazil, and then I went round the Amazon, and lots of people throwing rubbish into the river, and it was really sad. There was beautiful dolphins, and I just didn't really understand it. So I spoke to the locals, and they didn't really know anything about the impact of waste. I think you have to be quite well off to be able to kind of maybe have some education around sustainability, and it just really struck a chord with me that I wanted to use this sciencey techie hat in the context of sustainability. Fast forward, had a stint at a blockchain R&D company, which I think we'll talk about some more, and had some papers out from that. And now I'm at Accenture working in technology sustainability, very broad, as the name implies, but essentially it's making technology more sustainable. So green IT, reducing the impact of technology, but also using technology for sustainability. Sustainability being environmental and social use cases.
With a PhD in engineering and stuff, you can probably look at all sorts of different areas, but we're going to focus on one in particular today, which is, I think, something you're quite expert in, and that's blockchain. Now, when I think about blockchain, as not a scientist or an engineer, as a journalist. Journalists, by the way, are people who aren't clever enough to do proper jobs and decide that they can just tell stories about them and get away with that fact. That's me. So blockchain makes me think of crypto bros, of people hawking NFTs on X, formerly known as Twitter, or whatever. There's this surface layer of froth that accompanies the word blockchain that makes the whole thing reputationally a little bit negative. But I think you've got a different message for us, haven't you? First of all, for people like me who don't necessarily know what blockchain is, give us a very brief summary of what blockchain actually is.
So it's a way to share data, share information transparently, uh, and effectively allows you to do peer-to-peer transactions. So I can send you some data, some information directly to you, and I don't have to worry about doing it via another party. So it sounds a bit abstract, but it's effectively a way to share information in the digital world, and it also has the monetary aspect to it. I always like to point out the name Bitcoin. I think is quite self-explanatory, because bit being, of course, information, digital information, and coin being the monetary aspect. So really, it's the kind of fusion of those two concepts.
Yeah, but blockchain isn't just about currency. I think when most people have heard of Bitcoin, even if they don't necessarily understand it. And it is a kind of scary word, that kind of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies and how they're traded. There's some big headlines out there at the moment with certain individuals who've done some fairly shady things. So there's obviously, it's still a slightly chaotic kind of landscape to get your head around. But blockchain as a technology has all sorts of other applications potentially. And I think you have recently written a paper, in fact, a fully academic one that people with PhDs sort of put together, exploring some of that. So maybe you could give us an insight into what that is and what the topic of your inquiry was.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to touch on your point, blockchain has bad publicity, and I think really the reason for that is its use in crypto. So it's effectively, and something like Bitcoin as well, is effectively a very energy hungry way to move money around. We don't really need to maybe have these new ways of moving money around. That's not quite true, actually, because there are a lot of benefits from having digital currencies. You might have heard blockchain in the context of financial inclusion, basically reducing the costs of sending money abroad. So there are some really fantastic, and it comes back to the point I was saying about you not needing an intermediary. So the less sort of parties in between you and I transacting, then the more efficient and lower cost it should be. But yeah, my interest really has been to look at how you can use this technology beyond the financial sort of use case. And the paper explores how blockchain technology could help support the welfare system. Specifically, it takes sort of a twofold approach. One is the idea of we're seeing more and more welfare services being digitalized. An example in the UK is universal credit. So that's the first digital by default benefit. Lots of issues came up as a result of that. You have to think that the sort of consumers of something like universal credit, these are actually vulnerable people who need extra support, especially when it comes to concepts around digital inclusion. So do they have access to devices, data? Do they have the digital skills really to be able to navigate around this new sort of form of how people receive welfare? So that's sort of one aspect of digital welfare. But then the other one is the welfare of people in the digital world. And I think that's becoming more and more prevalent, and it will continue to do so as we see sort of more disruptive technologies like AI literally available at our fingertips, right? And I can't name a single person that hasn't had a play around with ChatGPT or, Um, so those two concepts, I think, are why we need to focus on digital inclusion. That's the kind of strategies and policies to really address the divide. There is a divide. There's about 3 billion people in the world that are digitally excluded. So again, coming back to those things I said around, do they have access to hardware? Do they have access to internet? Data poverty was a huge thing during lockdown. We saw when schooling went online, families having to choose between, you know, certain, like lowering their food expenses because they had
Yeah.
to, they had to pay for data. So the paper, coming back to the paper, it's looking at how can technology solve the problem that technology created, which is the digital divide.
Right. And so, in what ways does blockchain specifically play a role in that, conceptually, in terms of helping the underserved, helping to flatten the curve, if you like, to
Yeah.
borrow a pandemic turn of phrase, in terms of digital exclusion?
Maybe it would help to talk about some of the features of blockchain. So we've got this kind of high level definition of what blockchain is, but actually it's about what it delivers. I think that's really important. So the way that information is stored in a blockchain, it's called a blockchain for a reason. Information is stored in blocks. They're not, I mean, often when we describe this in my last job, we just get some Lego out, but it's not actually um, the way that sort of information will be bundled up together. So transactions, basically. So if we stick with the concept of finance, money, that's what you think of when you think of a transaction. I want to send you some money. That's a transaction. It's got my name. It's got your name. It's got the sum. You bundle a bunch of these transactions up into a block, and then some stuff needs to happen to get that block verified. Like, did I really send that money to you? Do I even have the funds to send you that in the first place? Do you exist? Have I sent it to the right person? These kind of things. How do you do that if you don't have a bank in the middle? Because ultimately that's what they're there for. You've got your account, you add a payee, you send to someone, that they'll ping, sort of send you a notification, say, oh, scam alert. um, if there's anything dodgy.
I think we've all had that experience.
Sorry, I wasn't calling you dodgy.
Well, no, it's perfectly acceptable to call me dodgy, but the fact is, I'm not really interesting enough to be that dodgy. But I might be in the supermarket being labelled as such by my bank, surprisingly, every now and then, which is I
What
don't know
has
why that
happened?
happens, but
Oh, when you
it
go
does.
abroad and suddenly they're like, oh, we've decided to cancel your card or block your transactions because we didn't know you
Right,
were
that
abroad.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Um,
Or read this text message that you can't get because you've got no signal before
yeah.
you will be allowed to buy this thing. Anyway, yeah,
Right. So
carry on.
so so you've got to figure out a way to be able to get effectively that verification mechanism, that trust up for someone to say, yep, stamp of approval. Chloe is really who she says she is. She really does have those funds and she really does intend to send them to Rom. And that's where the consensus algorithm comes into it. If you are decentralizing, if you are effectively distributing this trust, so I don't send everything via one intermediary via my bank, I want to send this money to you, then there needs to be some way to do this verification. And in the Bitcoin world, the consensus algorithm is proof of work, which effectively means that there's a lot of work being done. It's effectively maths puzzles that are being solved, and and what that does is then everyone in the network. So if you imagine little miners with mining hats on, they're not actually physically mining. They've just solving these maths puzzles. They will see your transaction and they'll verify the information, and then they'll say, yeah, this looks good, and then they send it off to the next miner and the next miner. And so in that way everyone gets that information, And then there's an incentive to be a miner, which is whoever solves the maths puzzle first wins a reward for basically mining the first block. What it's doing is effectively mobilizing a whole network rather than everything channeling through this black box being the bank. And I'm just using the bank as an example. Where it gets exciting is not only can I send you money, I could also attach some information to that. That's the data piece, right? So we can transact and I can set, say, the cost of, let's say you want to buy my PhD thesis. I don't think you do, but let's say I managed to convince you or my paper. Let's say you want to buy my paper. So I managed to convince you that you want to buy this paper. So I can then send that to you along with, you know, actually you should be sending me the funds, but yeah, we can do that exchange and we can do that transaction. So actually, when you think about this, you've got a system in which, and all of this lowers transaction costs, by the way, doing this sort of decentralized network. So what we arrive at is a way to transact peer to peer in a low cost way with transparency, because I mentioned those blocks, transactions be bundled into blocks. When the next block is created, it has to reference the last one. And this is where the chain comes in. So you've got this chain coming through of blocks of transactions. So if you and I do this, you know, I keep selling you my papers. Maybe you sell me some stuff too. And there doesn't have to be money involved, by the way. You can do this just with information, actually, if you just pay the transaction fee. We could then audit that exchange between us right back to day one. Right. Why this is powerful is because we live in a world now that is dominated by data. I think we're seeing a lot of fake news go around in social media. It's really tricky to audit, monitor, and verify what is real and what's not. And it can lead to actually quite big consequences. You know, it's no longer just, and now you bring AI into the mix, right? I mean, I'm seeing loads of AI generated photos, and so suddenly we're in this world where we don't know what's real and what's not. And now what blockchain offers is something that gives you that auditability, that transparency. The other fantastic thing is that once you've put something on there, you can't edit it. So you know that you can trust it. The reason being, coming back to that consensus algorithm, it's just too much effort to undo what's already on there. And there's no economic incentive for anyone involved. It would just be at a huge cost. So you really can trust actually the information on there too.
Let's assume that we've taken the conceptual stuff and we've taken blockchain as an underlying foundational sort of technology, and we want to use it to improve the digital well-being of people and use it in a welfare context. How can you illustrate that for us? What would that mean to people who are kind of underserved right now then?
Let's use lockdown as an example. So during the pandemic, it was quite tricky to be able to know who was isolated and who wasn't. I think perhaps also the impact of being in lockdown, you know, perhaps people didn't know that they were sort of at high risk of being isolated. You know, maybe they weren't then aware of the importance of technology, or maybe the lack of skills they had to sort of stay connected. So the paper that I wrote I wrote it during lockdown with very much with that in mind, is if everything were to move into the digital world, what's going to happen? How you can use something like blockchain is to help you track those citizens, those people that need that support. Currently, we don't get much transparency into data around citizens. So, you know, that any public sector sort of systems, anything that around the welfare system, for example, is behind closed doors, right? As it should be. You need to protect individuals' private data. But it means that you then can't really assess where we might have gone wrong, and where people might be not being served correctly. I'll give you an example as well. So, talking about digital welfare in the context of digitalizing social welfare, with things like the rollout of universal credit, there was a lot of issues that came from that system, from that scheme. You know, big payout delays, people struggling to there was no save form on the save function on the form online, so people would sort of try to fill it in, and then it would all disappear, and they'd have to
Yeah.
start
It's
again.
basic UX, isn't it? That, I mean, that's just anyway.
But there was a lot of issues in the back end as well. So the way the algorithm was, it just wasn't quite ready yet, and that's a really high risk thing to try, to digitalize and then not be able to track and see, well, what's going on, what's the problem. But then there are even more sort of sinister examples. I think there's I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Aadhaar, which is a biometric identification scheme in India, and there's some issues there in the way that the biometrics were being processed, and as a result, people were just being cut off entirely from their welfare support, to the point that they couldn't eat, and there's actually been people who've lost their lives as a result of this. So, and then going to the other part of the world, in America, there was one example of automated fraud detection. So something, I think it was in Michigan, where they used some automation software to be able to just get through the backlog of files they had to process, and try to identify where people were maybe fraudulent in the system. And then it made loads of mistakes, and then lots of people's lives basically got ruined as a result of that. So where
Yeah.
blockchain can help is to have some transparency into the way those systems work, because ultimately you or I cannot verify, and not, it doesn't have to be you or I, but even an auditor, it's really tricky. Again, in the UK, data is very siloed, so between different government departments, they're not just
Yeah.
all kind of using the same the same folders and files. It's
Right.
it's all over the place, so it's really tricky to audit these things. What we want to do with something like digital inclusion, the government can't fix this alone, right? Especially at the rate at which technology is advancing. There's a lot of sort of intel is locked up in the private sector. So actual understanding of how these technologies work and how you can best use them and what are the risks. So really what you want to do is incentivize people, from different parts of the world, of these sectors, to support with tackling the digital divide. It's like a concept of knowledge diffusion, basically. How can we, if I know that there's a sort of, this region over here is really struggling with technology, or that they don't have maybe as many skills as this region that's not far over here, how can we get them to sort of balance out? And that's where also the incentivization mechanism of blockchain becomes useful. So there are economic incentives baked into just the way the network works. I mentioned earlier that miners, those nodes that are running the network, that are having to do all these maths puzzles and having to do all the transaction verification, they have an economic incentive to do that. They're not just doing it because for fun.
Yeah.
Maybe they are. Regardless, there is an economic incentive.
Yeah.
And I think, we need to bring more transparency into welfare data. I talked about digitalization of social welfare, but then I also talked about digital welfare in the digital world. And again, with the example of AI, these are algorithms that are trained on a lot of biased data. So we need to be aware of the risks that these AI tools pose, and how can we monitor that? So it's coming back to those features that blockchain offers, that I'm not aware of any other technology that does that. It can offer transparency, auditability, at a low cost into these systems that are otherwise black boxes. We don't really know how to tackle them. And the idea specifically to digital inclusion would be to create incentives for digitally included people to support those that are vulnerable or excluded. Um,
Yeah.
and then we can enter the whole discussion around smart contracts and how you can automate a lot of this. And yeah, there's lots of ways in which you can do it, but I think the actual way you store the data is really powerful if you use blockchain for that.
Yeah. Do you think so? I've got kind of two questions leading on from all of that. Really, one is there a legislative layer here that needs to be kind of addressed? I know that we're both in the UK, so we're kind of focusing here. Um, with the government's on a digital transformation journey, it's releasing frameworks all the time and inviting, uh, the big familiar names that we're familiar of in an IT and emerging technology context to support those frameworks to try and transform this siloed kind of mess that you were kind of alluding to earlier on. But so we know that the motivation is there, but in the end, one of the core benefits, as far, if I understand what you're saying correctly, is it's like a democratization of data. It's saying, look, actually, by using this technology, we can put into the people's hands ownership of their authentic selves in a
Right.
digital
They
context.
can become consumers of their own data, of their own records, effectively, whether it's welfare, whether it's
Yeah.
healthcare.
But does that require, and then that's useful for those providing those services because in theory, you that information is there as long as the consent is there for you to access it as a social services provider or as a healthcare provider or as a tax agency or as a whatever it is. You should never, if you've got access to all of that information and it's all verified, right? You shouldn't make mistakes. You'll know exactly what that person needs or doesn't need. But in order to get that access and that consent, we're going to have to get over this thing that's always been in the way, aren't we? Which is the it's kind of like the opposition that you always get to the idea of a universal ID card, which has been mooted many times and it's never quite happened because everyone's like, oh no, I'm not going to let the government give me an ID card. What is this? What are we, fascists? Like, well, okay, you've got bank cards. Your mortgage company, by the way, knows more about you than you do. You've got credit cards. You've got a driver's license. You've got these things. You've got sort of 16 ID cards. The problem is they're not joined up, right? So it's really frustrating all the time whenever you want to do anything. This would actually help, but we never get over that problem.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Would you say that actually that's actually part of what needs to
Uh,
happen, kind of thing?
Definitely. When you say something like, "Oh, data on the blockchain is immutable; it can't be changed, and it's transparent and public," people think, "Oh God, what?" So, surveillance. I don't want to be tracked. I don't want to, have all my
So,
private information, my dirty laundry aired on a public blockchain. Of course, none of that. No one wants that.
right.
Surveillance is not a nice thing. No one wants to do that. But there's things around this. Just comes back to the idea of blockchain is not accessible yet. There are ways in which you can very easily put data on the blockchain that doesn't have to disclose any of your private information. We don't need to. We can be totally compliant with GDPR. We can, ensure that you don't have to put the raw sort of welfare. Coming back to the welfare example, you don't have to put welfare records like my individual personal data onto the blockchain. But what you could do is put a fingerprint of it on the blockchain, and that's just a way of referring to an encryption type of approach. It's called hashing. All it is basically effectively a fingerprint. It will take whatever input of data, doesn't matter how big it is, how much data you put in, and it'll spit out the same fixed size, effective like a string of numbers and letters, and that's like a code, right? That can only be generated from the input that you put in. So let's
Yeah.
say I put a movie in, I put it through this hash function, and it'll spit out this code. You can't backtrack from that code. It just looks like gobbledygook to you. But I if I put the right input in, I'll be able to. So that allows for auditing. You can do these one-way privacy sort of mechanisms, and really people don't want to learn about cryptography, like most people. I don't know. I'm sure people do, but
Some
like
people do.
don't be
PhD
very
type.
many cryptographers. But I mean, you shouldn't have to do a PhD in cryptography to benefit from this technology. So I think that's where we need to get a bit more of the applications out, make it more accessible, so that we can then create these ideas like I wrote about in the paper, and there would be no issues around privacy, because you just need to know what to put on the blockchain
Yeah.
to deliver on the to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. You don't need to put everything on the blockchain. They wouldn't make sense to, nor would be energy efficient to do that.
So it's fair to say that there's plenty going on in this space. There's plenty of potential. But Chloe, what's next for you? How are you actually going to start bringing this about then?
Well, lots of talk, so really promoting the idea. Thank you for having me. Want to do more things like this. Uh, so, but also maybe moving it from beyond the academia realm to actually implementing it. So, Accenture's really proactive in the digital inclusion space. They do work with sort of like leading charities to really help tackle the digital divide. So, I think it's about sort of starting to talk about blockchain in the context of digital welfare, which people may not marry them up, but to me it makes perfect sense. So right now it's going to be doing lots more engagement, and then the goal being let's build it, and see, show that it works.
Yeah,
That's the plan.
and I know that you can't really talk about the sort of things that you're getting and you're doing at Accenture at the moment, because there are lots of sensitivities and reasons for that. But on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it, do you think, that we're going to start to see this kind of technology improving the lot of us citizens in the next few years?
I think it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when, because I the speed at which technology now arrives to our homes, becomes accessible, is it's just shocking. Um, Saying that, I think blockchain, we've talked about how it's not accessible yet, but actually that I think that's because it's not been used in the way that it needs to be. So once that those use cases start to grow and develop, and it's less about the crypto side and more about actually the power that it brings when you put data on it, then I think it's going to really take off, because there's already discussions in government and you know public and private sector, just wondering what the impact of AI is going to be. And I think that will really propel us to think about the concept of digital welfare. And then it's a matter of finding the tool to help you deal with that, right? So
It might be worth mentioning that we will be publishing this piece of video and audio brilliance alongside our next issue of Tech for Good magazine. And in that, and on our website, you'll find perhaps what I think is an interesting example of how blockchain might be used for good things. There's a diamond company that we are very familiar with. They're quite big. They've been around for a while. And when I say they're quite big, they are they are the biggest and used to be the entire industry, I think, all on their own. But they are using blockchain, or will be, or in the process of using blockchain to create essentially digital twins of diamonds on the global market. Diamonds themselves have a reputational issue, or have done in the past, of in terms of their sourcing and where do these things actually come from, and when they enter. And certain Hollywood movies maybe have helped to exacerbate that reputational problem. But blockchain is a technology that might actually be able to answer some of those questions on behalf of people who are buying diamonds, and that's the thing. If you want to read more about that, you can do that in the next issue of our magazine, and I think there will be some video to watch as well. There's lots of good things to look forward to then, clearly, over the next few years. Whether it's this, whether it's invisibility cloaks for microbes, your impact is in to be found in various places. By the way, would you join me on another episode of this to talk about microbial invisibility cloaks and the applications thereof?
Yes, of course.
Right, great. Come over to techforgood.net to read more about this topic, about blockchain for good. You can read more about the diamond use case that we've been talking about as well. Plus, find links to go and find Chloe on the internet if you want to go and harass her about this particular topic. I'm sure she'd welcome it. In the meantime, thanks very much again, Chloe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.